Hello and welcome to the Emerging Tech Horizons podcast. I'm Arun Serafin, Executive Director of NDIA's Emerging Technologies Institute. There's a lot of discussion these days about improving government efficiency. But what a lot of people might not realize is just how skilled the staff at the Government Accountability Office, or GAO, is at diving deep into complex government programs and policy issues, into practices and programs, and identifying challenges and successes and areas for improvement. One area where GAO regularly applies this expertise is defense acquisition. Some of their recent work is focused specifically on DoD's implementation of the adaptive acquisition framework, which is aimed at streamlining acquisition processes at the Pentagon that control how DoD develops and delivers systems. Today we're going to talk about one of GAO's recent reports on innovation and acquisition. It's called DoD Acquisition Reform, Military Departments Should Take Steps to Facilitate Speed and Innovation. Joining us today to talk about the findings of this study and discuss how the insights in the study can directly shape program design at DoD and how it affects defense industry are our guests Shelby Oakley and Robert Bullock from GAO. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
Shelby serves as the director of GAO's Contracting and National Security Acquisitions Office, and Rob is the assistant director there. So welcome, thanks for joining today's podcast. Let me just dive right in. GAO does a lot of reports, Shelby, and you've been on the program before talking about reports. Can you talk about why you took on this particular report and how long you worked on it and the kind of methodology you use to get in after something like this?
Yeah, absolutely. We appreciate being here to talk about this report. We took on this specific topic looking at how the military departments are implementing the adaptive acquisition framework because of the flexibilities that are provided by OSD to the military departments to be able to do their own thing in a lot of cases. So as you're well aware, much of the changes of the adaptive acquisition framework are focused on the military services being able to tailor their approaches to what makes sense for their programs. So we really wanted to take a look at, okay, what are they doing? How are they tailoring? How are they making their lives easier, more streamlined to be able to leverage the flexibilities that were provided by the AAF?
And there's some evidence and data at this point, right? Because if I think back, a lot of this latest generation of acquisition reform is now about 10 years old.
Yeah.
FY16 NDAA is kind of the last big kickoff. So you've actually got some stuff to look at.
Yeah, a decent amount of time has passed to be able to kind of make changes to these program approaches, and a lot of new programs have started to be able to structure their acquisitions under this adaptive acquisition framework. So we thought it was good timing because we've done the look at the OSD level, we've looked at the policies, we've assessed the the AAF itself at that higher level, but then kind of coming down to the service level is important because of the authorities that they were granted through, the 2018-ish reforms to really lead the charge for acquisition. So that we thought was super important to get to where the rubber hits the road. We do a lot of work on these reports. We spent a year plus on this report. We talked to close to 100 people, I think, at all levels of DoD, both in the services and within OSD, talking to them and collecting data and documents and information to be able to, elicit our findings for this report. So we talked to individuals all throughout DoD to try and really figure out how that implementation of the AAF was going within DoD and at the service level specifically. And, to do our work, I don't know if people are broadly familiar with how we do our work, but there is pretty much anybody with any degree, with any specialization and any background at GAO that's involved in our work. So where we need engineering expertise, where we need cost estimating expertise, where we just need analysts, we have all those folks that come together to be able to assess the information that we're finding and then put out these reports.
Yeah, and we've tapped into your technical expertise with the group, your sister group, I guess it's called Science, Technology, and Analytic Assessments, I think. A couple of those folks have helped us out with our Technology 101 web series.
Yeah.
And they're very technical people.
Yep, they're absolutely a stakeholder on most of our jobs in the areas in which I work on because of the technical nature of the work that we do.
That's great. So your recent work in general, like you were talking about, not the least of which is this report we're going to talk about, focuses a lot about speed and innovation. And so just to frame that, why is it that we're these days thinking so much about the delivery of these innovative capabilities to warfighters?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things at play that makes this the thrust of the issue right now, getting capabilities in a speedy manner and being able to continually innovate. First of all, there's the speed at which technology evolves nowadays is completely different than it was even 10 years ago. And so DoD's ability to be able to leverage those advances will be hindered if it doesn't kind of make different changes to be able to do things differently. You know, speed is also an issue because for the first time in decades, we're now facing this near-peer threat that requires us to keep up with the pace of advancements of these near peers, which we all know to be fairly significant. And so every strategy document that you read, both at the DoD level and at the service level, really focuses on how can we get these capabilities out to the warfighter quickly so they're well equipped to be able to respond to these threats, and how do we do it in a flexible and adaptable enough way to be able to respond to changing threats, but also respond to advancing technology.
Yeah, there's another element of speed that we run into here at NDIA. There's an expectation of return for investors.
Mm-hmm.
More and more, we're seeing investment in these new technologies and hopefully in acquisition systems by private sector investors, but they expect a return at some reasonable amount of time. And that's a different kind of speed. And so the slow delivery, it works against what you were talking about, but it works against me if I thought I was going to get something out of this investment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what you're referring to is obviously a lot of these technology advancements are coming from, you know, less traditional type companies in the defense industrial base. And, you know, they can't sit around for 10 years for a weapon system to be bought in mass quantity to be able to get that return on investment. And thinking about kind of how acquisitions can be structured to be able to insert those types of technologies regularly and ongoing is a lot of the focus of our work now.
So can't understand why anyone would be against this, but tell me about how DoD is reacting to all of this need for speed.
Yeah, I mean, so on paper, DoD is very much in line with the types of things that we're, you know, advocating for and that we're reporting. They certainly have this focus on trying to streamline processes, trying to put in place acquisitions that are responsive, but when the rubber hits the road, we're still finding a lot of challenges. So while they've concurred with our recommendations in a number of instances that would focus them on speed and innovation, we're not seeing kind of like the wholesale change that's going to be required to really make a dramatic shift.
And so, Rob, when you looked through this report at the ways DoD is thinking about this, one of the things that's come up in the last decade or so is the creation of, like you talked about in the report, the adaptive acquisition framework, which creates these different pathways. And so, I mean, I was one of the people on the Hill that tried to work on some of these pathways. We thought they would help with speed. We thought they would help with giving DoD some different kinds of choices. How did you all think about looking at these pathways and kind of what did you find?
So we, for this report, wanted to look at the pathways from the standpoint of what were the services doing to actually implement them on the ground. And I think, you know, Shelby mentioned earlier that devolution of authorities to the services means that really is where the action is, where the rubber hits the road for the implementation of these kinds of reforms. But what we found, this work and others, is it's still taking a very long time for weapons acquisition programs to deliver capability to the warfighter, despite the fact that these pathways have been put in place, despite the fact that there is a lot of tailoring available to program managers and to programs.
Is yet to be found a measurable improvement in speed of delivery.
Well, the way we like to say it is that there's a measurable improvement in getting programs started. There's not a measurable improvement in getting programs finished.
Finished meaning low rate production?
Meaning, production? Capability to the warfighter.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. And so, what is this then? What's the root cause of that, you think?
So, one of the things we've looked at to try to understand, well, how can you break this logjam within DoD? How do leading companies that are developing complex cyber physical products, so these are products that really integrate hardware and software, there's these companies that are able to bring those to market quickly in a profitable manner and to continue to innovate and iterate in a swift fashion. And so there's something there that could be learned from, that DoD could learn from for its own product development activities. So one of the things we've done, and I think we'll get into it a little bit more, is what exactly are those practices that leading companies adopt? And it's our contention that there's a lot that DoD can learn from those practices. And so, setting up these pathways is a great step, and these policy flexibilities are a great step and a great tool for program managers. But are there more steps that we put in place to actually drive the kind of speed of delivery that we're not seeing today?
So let's talk about that now for a second. So some of these companies, leading companies, in what kind of sectors?
Go.
Across the board, I think we've looked at technology, automotive, kind of software, hardware. We really kind of tried to run the gamut on those. Yeah.
And what are examples of some of the practices?
Yeah, so the way in which that we do this work is we go out and we talk to all these companies that are willing to speak to us. We identify them through a pretty rigorous process of looking at performance, profitability, in their market share, awards, innovation awards, kind of all the inputs that you would imagine that you're pointing to. Yes, X company is top notch from a private sector perspective. We tried to kind of avoid government contractors just because we wanted to focus on folks outside of that sphere. And so from that work, we gleaned an approach that they take that we call iterative product development. And iterative product development hinges on continuous cycles of design, modeling, validation, and feedback loops all throughout the process. And so really what we see is these companies, they begin these cyber physical products that are software defined, hardware enabled systems.
What? A plane?
Like anything. You can have a truck, you can have a, semiconductor,
Computer.
Anything. Yeah, we've kind of hit the gamut on, ships. We've looked at ships, everything that you could imagine that is a product that is now increasingly software enabled is what we were focused on. And so they take these approaches that, unlike DoD, they don't start with extremely rigid defined requirements
For the final product.
Yes, they start with high level requirements, and then they go through these cycles of design, modeling, validation, and feedback to be able to gain knowledge and understand what is the art of the possible to provide meaningful capability, meaningful value to the customer in their case, but in DoD's case, meaningful capability to the warfighter in the shortest amount of time. And then that's what you go after. Those are the requirements that you settle in on for your minimum viable product. But the notion of a minimum viable product doesn't mean that that's the end. That means that's the beginning, right? Because the feedback from that minimum viable product then loops back into your continuing assessment of what's next. What's the next capability that we can provide? What's the next requirement that we can provide to these warfighters that would be meaningful to them?
What you're describing sounds a little bit like what software guys call agile development, DevSecOps kind of things, but you're saying it's good for hardware systems.
Mm-hmm.
It's good for cyber physical systems.
Cyber physical systems, yeah.
It probably springs out of the software space,
Yeah.
but there's application to it, absolutely.
Okay, but now projecting that onto our dear federal acquisition process, let me ask you some snarky questions here. Right? I guess I don't understand the difference between a minimal viable product and a threshold requirement. I'm completely comfortable with threshold requirements. Is there any difference between the two?
There is a difference, is that those threshold requirements are set before anybody knows anything about what can be achieved. And so when we talk about the gaining of knowledge through these iterative cycles, that's really what drives what sets that threshold requirement or that minimum viable product requirement. And so, when you think about some of the weapons programs that we've seen before, they spend years chasing these requirements, only to, have it take 10 to 15 years to get a system fielded that's already obsolete by the time it's fielded and needs to be modernized. And so what we're trying to avoid is that exact scenario. What we're trying to advocate for is how can the DoD leverage these new types of systems, these cyber physical systems in the context of their world, to be able to get a capability out there quickly with speed. We're not talking like 10 years. We're talking, a couple of years to be able to get things out there with the notion that the warfighter can bet that something else is coming that is going to either be responsive to a changing threat or incorporate additional technology or be responsive to learning and feedback from, I should have said and instead of or, be responsive to learning and feedback through those iterative cycles and the use by the warfighter.
Have you done work on best practices to write requirements for minimal viable products?
We have that work ongoing right now. Okay. So our leading practices body of work is kind of expansive. So we've done 2 jobs so far. We're looking at the front end of the process right now where you're developing your business case, you're setting those high-level requirements.
Always used to tell me programs that start off badly will finish
badly. You want it bad enough, you're going to get it bad, right? And that's I think what we see, and that's what we're trying to avoid.
And it's really drawing a contrast to what we'd call the linear kind of product development approach that is the traditional DoD approach, which up front we need to exactly nail down what all of our requirements are. What's our design going to be to meet those requirements, only those requirements? What's the funding that we need? And we're going to need to get up front to support those requirements. And then you kind of throw those requirements over the wall into the acquisition space. And maybe 10 or 15 years later, you get something back that is no longer relevant to the needs of the warfighter at that time. The beauty of this more iterative approach is it also brings in that user feedback, both, when you're talking about what is the requirement here, what do I need? And then as those requirements change, having that constant loop of feedback from the end user, from the warfighter, so that we do, in a shorter period of time, deliver them something that is still of value to them.
And you're saying that can be done, you can develop requirements like that, you can talk to the warfighters that way, you can change contractual requirements. All of that is legal, permissible, maybe under these pathways.
Well, and on the contractual front, again, this is getting away from one great contract that will cover the life cycle of the development of the program. Are there smaller, more modular contracting approaches we can take, bite-sized chunks of the program, and shorter contracts, less money at stake. We learn a little bit and then see where to go from there on a contractual standpoint.
I would say you're describing a very smart customer. And so I wonder if the system is capable of that.
I think there's a lot of work to get there. I think it takes different skill sets and different technologies to be able to enable this. Much of what we talk about are the digital tools that would enable an iterative development effort. They don't exist broadly within DoD yet, nor within much of the industrial base that supports DoD. And so that's a sea change that we think needs to come, because it's those tools like digital twinning and having a digital thread that enable companies to speed through these cycles and gain knowledge much, much more quickly than they have in the past. The other thing that I want to mention about what Robert said is, the key to this approach is that the funding is scaled based upon the knowledge that is gained, right? And so when you're thinking about how companies work, and what we've seen in companies is that they don't throw the entire investment that they think they're going to have after, this idea that they have, right? They scale the investment as they gain knowledge and see, okay, this is going to be a valuable product. Like, we're going to make something off of this. So now we can scale that investment.
Again, that's completely legal. One way I could think about that is that's what the science and technology and prototyping funds are for.
Yeah.
The other way I could think about it is, and you've done a lot of work on NASA, is sort of milestone-based payments. Right? You can think about structuring that way as well.
Yeah, it could be. There's a lot of different ways to tackle it. And honestly, I think there's a lot of thinking that needs to go into how this could look, both from the contracting perspective, because that will be a change for how they go about contracting, from the budgeting perspective, and then also from the like overarching program management perspective, right? Like how are we managing these capabilities instead of potentially how are we managing these programs is something that we are, you know, thinking a lot about.
Okay, couple more snarky, this will never work questions. Okay, what about the angry GAO auditors and the testers and the cost analysts? Can they operate in this iterative environment?
Yeah, I think there's a cultural change that needs to happen across the board. We do have an ongoing job on test and evaluation that is assessing kind of the readiness or the positioning of the test community to be able to support these types of approaches. So stay tuned for that. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, from our perspective in GAO, we're trying to kind of think differently than we always have about like, you know, this is a milestone, this is a milestone, this is what we expect to see, versus how are we seeing programs doing these iterative cycles, learning fast and potentially failing fast. And that's not a bad thing if you haven't dumped $12 billion, you know, in it. If you're, you know, scaling that funding and being able to learn and fail fast,
cutting your losses quickly.
It's much more palatable.
Right. Okay. Oversight community, you're saying, can find their way into this process as well. Now, maybe the hardest, we don't budget this way.
Mm-hmm.
Does the budgeting system have to change to support this? Are there examples of budgeting systems that work well with an iterative process?
I mean, I think if you look at some of the proposals that the PPB Commission came out with recently, they would lend themselves to supporting this kind of an approach where there would be a little more flexibility in the funding, you know, whether that's changing thresholds for reprogramming around, whether that's thinking differently about the capability and portfolio funding and moving to a new model there. There are opportunities for Congress to take a look at those and understand that if you want to truly support getting to this iterative development approach within the department, then some of those funding flexibilities would be very helpful to that as well.
I mean, the bottom line is everybody needs to recognize that what we're doing now is not working, right? And things need to pretty significantly change. Because as you know, Arun, there's been so many reforms over the years that have made some improvements, right? I mean, we're not seeing the types of programs that we saw in the past where you're having like, you know, 12 new critical technologies that aren't matured as you begin the program. Like there is some difference now in the types of programs that we're seeing. But if we want this kind of wholesale change that's responsive to changing threats, that's responsive to new technologies and innovations, it's going to require a lot of people to do things differently.
Maybe even harder than budget is culture.
Yeah.
And so what's your sense about DoD's culture, willingness to accept this, and the danger that it just slips back into the old system?
I think when you know, as part of this report, we kind of poured through the policies that the services have in place to support the different pathways. And at the end of the day, there is nothing stopping them in policy or in statute from pursuing all the kinds of approaches we're talking about when it comes to an iterative development structure. But, you know, there is a fear and kind of I don't want to be the one who goes out over my skis and takes a risk and then it goes wrong and then I'll be blamed for it. You know, even if you're allowed to do something, if you're not explicitly told to do something, there's a little bit of a disconnect there. And so, you know, there are opportunities for program managers, PEOs, kind of at all those levels to be willing to take on more risk, but they have to have cover from leadership to go ahead and do that. And I think even in some of the you know, recent memos that have been coming out on using the software pathway as much as possible, and maybe bringing some of those disciplines onto the hardware side, that's providing some air cover and some running room for program managers to take those risks and maybe begin to change that culture.
I think that's one of the reasons why we made the recommendations that we made in the report that related to pilot programs, because we saw within talking to the programs that we talked to a kind of a fundamental misunderstanding or not really being able to envision how this type of approach could apply to what they were doing. And so we see that it's kind of an important thing that DoD gives an example, right? Like more than one, obviously, of how this could work and how this could look and how it could be successful or maybe it's not successful, and what are the lessons learned and things that need to change to be able to enable it. And so that's why we made the recommendations to each of the services. Hey, pilot these approaches on a few programs so that people can see things being done differently and how they could apply to them, and then take those lessons.
And I think people would be surprised that GAO actually does a lot of best practices work, and you have a series of reports out there that people could look at to show other people, other programs making use of other authorities, succeeding, even GAO giving them credit, right? But then hopefully that works in your favor to do the same things in your job.
Yeah.
And that's been something of a change, I think, in the way GAO has done its work over time. In the past, it would be a lot more, if you like, Monday morning quarterbacking, that a program has already failed, and we'd go in and point out the points of failure. But there's much more value from us being able to get ahead of that and say, you could be going off the rails if you carry on this way. And then what we can also now bring to the table are these leading practices that have worked in companies and that are applicable in the DoD space as well.
We talked about the software pathway in the new memo. How about the other pathways? There's so many different ones, rapid and middle tier and major capability. But how are those faring in this iterative?
So we did find difference between software and the others. The software pathway very naturally lends itself to these iterative cycles, to getting lots of user feedback in there. And when you look both at the DoD level and at the services, the policies that they have for the software pathway really do line up very much with the practices that we have. When you look, though, at the other pathways, and we focused on 3 others in particular. So one is the urgent capabilities. That's really getting something out in 2 years very quickly with a lot of existing technologies. There's the middle tier of acquisition. So that's kind of a 5-year cycle to either prototype or rapidly field something, and again, get capability to the warfighter as quickly as possible. And then the other pathway that we looked at is really the traditional one, the major capabilities pathway. And that's where your very largest programs would still go through that. And when you look at the policy level there, you don't see really discussion of these continuous iterative cycles of development. You don't see that structure laid out that the program would need to engage with to put in place the kind of practices that we're describing.
But you don't see a prohibition.
No.
Absolutely not, from either the service level or from the OSD level.
And in fact, OSD, when we talk to them, they're like, the services can move out on this. Like, they can move out on making these types of changes. And I think that's a really important point. And the reason why we looked at the service level was they can make these approaches work for them.
There's nothing prohibiting it either in OSD guidance, federal acquisition regulation, or law.
Yeah.
And for most contractors, most of their engagement is not going to be at the OSD policy level. It's going to be at the program manager level, maybe the PEO level. Is there a role for the contractors to play to push their government customers to be more iterative in their design of the program?
So I'd say, one area is this, to the extent that their own processes, their own investments in technologies kind of lend themselves to the iterative cycle, letting the department know about that. And because it can really be a partnership and a collaboration between the contractor and the program itself. So making sure that the program knows what they're capable of could feed into that.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I think in the case of these, companies, they can kind of show they're serious about making changes in this regard by investing in the types of tools and resources that are needed to support these iterative cycles, like the digital capabilities, like the digital twin, being able to develop a digital thread that they can use to design and rapidly test and validate and receive feedback on the program and the approach. And so I think it's definitely possible. I just, it's not, oftentimes, DoD has to kind of lead the charge with what they want, right? And if they are consistent about saying, we want to be able to get capabilities out to the warfighter faster, be responsive to technology changes and innovation and threat changes, then they need to be able to say that so that contractors can be responsive.
So I want to give you a chance to actually talk about the specific recommendations that you've made in this report. So do you want to run through an overview of what you pushed on here in terms of especially iterative development?
Absolutely. So I think, overall in the report, one part of it, we look at to what extent are the services implementing the flexibilities of the adaptive acquisition framework. And we actually found that, they'd all put out policies and guidance that very much aligned with the overall DoD approach to the pathways. And we're pursuing the pathways in a way that made sense. But what we didn't find lots of evidence of, or really much evidence of, was these iterative structures of development in policy and in practice. With one exception, that being the software pathway that really is, imbued with agility and with that iterative approach.
So on that, is this an actual example of where we're seeing software being delivered fast?
So as you know, Arun, we look at weapon systems mainly, not the business system side of things. We have another team that does the kind of wholly software based system. So I can't necessarily comment on how that is working. What we see though, and what we have identified in other reports is there's limited use of the software pathway by weapon systems programs. So when you think about they're not leveraging that tool that would provide them the ability to be able to deliver software more quickly to the extent that they should be. And this comes down to the flexibility that programs have to use multiple pathways to achieve their intended purpose. And
because you can stack pathways, you can pick and choose between.
Yeah, you can
pathways.
lop off a part of your program, be like, this is appropriate for the software pathway, this is appropriate for MTA. There's a whole lot of ways to be able to do this, and people just aren't doing it. And so what we recommended in that report, not in this report, was that DoD really needs to focus on guidance for weapons programs about using the software pathway as a part of their overall, approach to the program, because of the goodness that we saw in that pathway, because it doesn't exist, for them in that context.
I interrupted the recommendations. Keep going.
So we kind of had two sets of recommendations, and they were each made to the Army, to the Air Force, and the Navy, and it was the same two recommendations to each. So the first of them was to update their policies and guidance with language that would really embed that iterative development structure into programs, really give that air cover to program managers to go ahead and explicitly follow those approaches. And then the other set of recommendations was, as Shelby was talking about earlier, identify one or more cyber-physical products and use that as a pilot program for using the iterative approach, both to show others that this can be done, and also to learn lessons about, here's some things we may need to change about implementing policy on the iterative design structure. With a good pilot, you learn from it, and then you kind of spread that out to the rest of the community. And so, we saw an opportunity there to use a pilot program or programs to really push this further.
And people may not realize this, but you give the services and DoD generally a chance to react to those kinds of recommendations, and you actually print those reactions in the report. So in this case, how did they react?
So the Navy and the Air Force agreed with both recommendations and started to point to work they're doing that even is beginning to take progress on those steps. The Army partially agreed, and the one area that they were a little hesitant on was about the applicability of the recommendations to the urgent capability pathway. Their contention is that really uses a lot of already mature technologies. There's not a lot of development going on in the urgent space. And I think, we'd say that's a true statement. But what that means is you're probably quite close to having a minimum viable product already. Mm-hmm. So use these processes to get that out as quickly as you can, and then use these processes to further iterate upon it and improve in future versions in any way that you can. So we would maintain that our recommendations apply really across those four pathways that underpin weapon system programs.
One of the things that seems to underlie all of this is, let's say it again, that government workforce needs to behave differently, needs to be trained differently. We talked about industry, helping them understand what could be done. Mm-hmm. You do mention DAU as a potential place to do some of this training. What's going on that front? So
there's a few things going on with DAU. I mean, that is really the central clearinghouse for core training on using the adaptive acquisition framework and using the pathways. DAU hosts on their site really all of the documentation and practices that that go under the pathways. That's all done on the DAU site. We talked to them as part of this work. There was one program we met with where DAU almost served as a consultant with them to help them think through what's the right pathway and what's the right way to implement it here. So I think there's a lot of goodness going on at DAU and also training done by the services. But maybe the missing piece here is that demonstration of how these iterative structures could and do work. And that's where our recommendation for the pilot program would come in to help fill that gap and really get, it's one thing to have policy, it's one thing to have training, but if I see real examples of this working well for my colleagues, then I'm more likely to pursue it myself.
In terms of specific programs that you would say are doing better than most, are there any you would call out at this point?
So, we didn't necessarily, for the programs we worked with for this particular report, we weren't necessarily evaluating them. We were just seeing how are you going about implementing the pathways and putting in place the iterative structures. Those on the software pathway, seem to be doing more that would lend itself to the iterative pathway. One that we met with was the Army's robotic combat vehicle, which they're actually an example of a program doing both an MTA and a software pathway kind of at the same time. And they were able to get benefits from moving the software effort more quickly through various milestones, and they didn't have to wait for the hardware elements to keep up. And so they'd found some value to that.
And one thing to note is, we do an annual assessment of weapons programs that gets issued in your early summer every year. This is the first year that we are assessing all of the programs against these iterative practices. And so you'll get a really good assessment of progress in the programs that are doing well in that regard in that report that is coming soon.
On the training side, we have people trained to be contracting officers and they get acquisition certifications. I guess Defense Acquisition University, DAU, at this point, are they developing similar certifications on iterative processes?
That's a good question. I don't know that we know that answer.
Yeah, I mean, the training they have is very focused on the pathways.
And, to the extent that for your DAWIA certifications, you'd need some of that potentially. But no, that's a good question for us to look at.
And I guess then maybe the answer to this would be no. Are there places, if a government civilian wanted to learn more, other than looking at your reports, is there a how-to? Is there even a commercial offering that tells you how to do iterative?
Yeah, not that I'm aware of, but we're always happy to talk to people about what we've seen and how this could look. And we do a lot of this with our own staff when they're going out and assessing these weapons programs. We talk to them about these practices and how they might show up. And we provide a lot of resources. There's a really great graphic that was in actually my testimony from last week before the Senate Armed Services Committee, that really gives a sense of how the practices, how the principles that we find line up with the iterative cycles of development. And it gives a sense of how these might look in every phase of those iterative cycles. And so I would suggest folks take a read of our reports and get a sense of what that is. And we're always available for folks to reach out to us and share what we know.
And we can drop in links to those reports into the text box under this video. So as we close up here, then, I think most industry folks would say these engagements are between GAO and the department. My customer, I don't know when they're going on. I don't know how to engage with them. What's your advice to industry people, and what's the value to industry people on how and when to engage with GAO?
We're open to engagement anytime. We think that the better relationships that we have and communication with industry we have will only benefit everybody, both from our understanding of the limitations and challenges that industry faces, but also from their understanding of what it is that we're finding and reporting, and how kind of DoD is responding, and to get a sense of kind of what's next. So I would encourage anybody to reach out to me, and I would be happy to share information. We have meetings all the time with folks from industry where we, talk through various different aspects of our work.
And you're capable of handling classified information.
Everything.
You know how to deal with proprietary information. You Will you take information off the record on background, that sort of thing as well?
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes in these kind of more informal engagements versus I'm auditing X program and you're the contractor and I need to meet with you, that's maybe a little bit different than, an engagement around something like this
A
where
best practice.
yeah, exactly. So, we're always willing to kind of have those more informal conversations for sure.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much for joining us. Shelby, Oakley, and Rob Bullock are with the Government Accountability Office. The report is called, boy, this is long, Military Departments Should Take Steps to Facilitate Speed and Innovation. Thanks you both for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everyone.
If you all enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to like and subscribe to our episodes. We're available on YouTube and anywhere you find your podcast. A special thank you to Melanie Yu and Daniel Park for producing the podcast. I want to do a commercial for all of our upcoming events and webinars and workshops. Please visit the ETI website and the NDI website for information on those events and registering for them. The August 27th through 29th conference at the Washington, D.C. Convention Center. Information will be out soon on that. That's our Emerging Technologies for Defense conference and exhibition, where we talk about some of these innovative practices and programs. And it's going to be an opportunity for the new administration to show us some of their new initiatives and their new leadership. So we hope you all take a look at that. And thank you all again for tuning into Emerging Tech Horizons.